The attacks on the US Congress on January 6, 2021 have shocked the world, with many asking, how could this happen? How could political polarization produce this level of hatred and violence? There are almost as many approaches to explain the rising trend in polarization as there are scientists in the field. We want to focus on a theory that identifies the deeper roots of political polarization in people's moral beliefs. This theory, created by Jonathan Haidt, is called moral foundations theory. Haidt postulates the existence of 6 distinct moral foundations, each named after a pair of virtue and vice. Using questionnaires, Haidt and his team found that liberals particularly espouse the care versus harm and fairness versus cheating moral foundations, while conservatives also embrace loyalty, betrayal, authority versus subversion, and purity versus disgust. Liberty versus oppression is a foundation that both sides endorse. However, this research doesn't conclusively prove that differences in moral foundations, which we call moral divergence, really cause polarization. And many other differences between liberals and conservatives have been identified as well. If differences in moral foundations really cause polarization, we would expect that historical periods with high polarization should be characterized by greater moral divergence than politically harmonious periods. But the problem is, we cannot send questionnaires back in time to measure the moral divergence 50 or 100 years ago. This is why, for this study, we quantify moral rhetoric rather than moral attitudes. More specifically, we look at speeches held by members of the US Congress over the last 144 years. We use an extended version of the Moral Foundations Dictionary developed by Graham et al. To quantify how many terms related to the different moral foundations members of Congress use. Then, we aggregate these numbers on the level of political parties and check for every 2-year legislative period how far Republicans and Democrats' moral rhetoric differs. We call this our Moral Divergence Index, or MDI. Let's look at the trajectory of moral divergence between Democrats and Republicans. As you can see, moral divergence reached a first peak around 1910, then declined over the next decades and remained on a very low level until the 1980s. Then it started to rise sharply, a trend that is continued until 2017, the end of our time series. Let us compare this trajectory now with the nominate metric developed by Poole and Rosenthal, which is based on voting records of members of Congress. The difference in average nominate position between Republicans and Democrats in Congress is usually seen as the gold standard in quantifying of political polarization. If we overlay the trajectory of moral divergence with a parallel time series of nominate-based polarization, we can immediately see that they are strongly correlated. In fact, the Pearson correlation between them is 0.7. But if we add a lag of 3 legislative periods, meaning that the polarization predicts moral divergence 6 years in advance, the correlation still increases to 0.9. This could suggest that polarization actually drives moral divergence rather than the other way around, as postulated by moral foundations theory. So far, we have looked at the difference between the two parties, treating them as if they were monolithic entities. However, we notice that the picture is actually more complex. If we look at specific legislative periods, for example, from 2015 to 2017, we see that there are correlations between moral rhetoric and ideological position that go beyond simple party-level differences. Fairness cheating terms are especially prominent in the speeches of ideologically extreme members of Congress. A similar picture emerges for liberty oppression, although he is strongly biased towards extreme conservative members of Congress. In contrast, loyalty betrayal rhetoric seems to be adopted more by the ideological center. In conclusion, while differences in moral rhetoric are closely aligned to ideological polarization, it appears more likely that changes in moral rhetoric follow changes in polarization rather than preceding them. Furthermore, the relationship between ideology and moral rhetoric is more complex than predicted by the simple liberal-conservative dichotomy postulated by moral foundations theory. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to any questions, critique, or suggestions.